Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to our second day of our conference on the Greater Good. Once again, my name is Tom Wilson. My background in group psychotherapy reminds me it's always important to trust the group process, to let it unfold. So here we are about a third of the way through our group and its process. And I expect possibly some changes as we move along. But trusting the group process, I knew, I hoped, the questions would emerge, similarities, issues, themes, which would focus our variety of viewpoints so that we would come away not even more bewildered with the questions of the greater good, but with clarity, with greater understanding. Those themes will continue to develop throughout the day. But for example, we've already raised such questions as, well, what is the greater good exactly? Who is included, in fact, in the collective? How do we know what is good for the collective? And who makes that decision? The collective itself or the leader? In some cases, who may be the best informed of what is the best for the collective. Another key issue is how do we know an action is actually pro-social rather than egoistic in its source? We come back again and again to the question of motivation. What are the motives of the actor, of the agent? And until we know what the motivations are, it's difficult to read the intent and forecast the consequences of the action in the long run. Another fundamental question we knew we would collide with is what is human nature?
Are we basically caring creatures, gregarious by nature, ready to help others, or are we fundamentally egoistically motivated? And is the source of that motivation our emotions, perhaps left over from an earlier evolutionary era, or is it due to our rationality? Perhaps a more surprising question we've encountered several times as well is not just human nature in general, but individual variation. That there's differences among us, in fact, as some of us perhaps may be more egoistically oriented, some of us may be more other-oriented and pro-social. Individual variations were mentioned throughout the talks, and probably we'll come back to them again and again throughout this day. Another question, of course, what is evidence? What information do we turn to settle these sorts of questions? And because we are deliberately multidisciplinary, we have people from very different backgrounds sharing their ideas with us, but relying on very different sources of evidence. And we have to remember to be tolerant of the different disciplinary viewpoints as we share that evidence. And perhaps the final question, which I'm sure we will solve by 5 o'clock this evening, is a commitment to the greater good the moral high ground, after all? Is it the morally correct thing to do across situations? With those questions in mind, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Eric Daniels. Dr. Daniels is a research professor at Clemson University. He is a distinguished lecturer on American history, particularly on American intellectual history, business history, and political history. After working at Duke University's program on values and ethics in the marketplace for a number of years, he moved on to his current position at the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. He's widely published on such topics as entrepreneurship, capitalism, and the history of business in America, and his books include the U.S. Economic Freedom Index. Dr. Daniels will lead us through the history of individualism in early American thought. Dr. Daniels.
Thank you. Good. All right, we're good. I've actually done a bit of modification, both based on suggestion and I think what might bring more discussion into our topic today. And what I'd like to do is briefly summarize, since you've all had my paper and had a chance to look at it, briefly summarize what the points I raised in that paper are, and then offer a bit of information that I was not able to offer in the paper itself, which I think might help contribute to a more robust discussion about it, which is namely why I think some of these changes are taking place. One of the interesting artifacts, as someone who's trained as a historian, when I go to interdisciplinary conferences and do interdisciplinary work, is that people often respond to my work by saying, well, that's a nice story. And can you tell us more stories? And that's what the history guy does. The history guy tells nice stories. But I'd like to, in a way, offer some critical insights that I think we might draw from this story that I've told about the history of individualism in American thought. And then also I'd like to wrap up what I hope, if I can keep disciplined, some briefer comments so that we have more time for discussion. Wrap up with making a few observations of how this critical narrative that I offer ties in with some of the other observations of the paper, some of the similarities that I think we might draw, as well as some of the differences and some of the reasons for those differences. So to begin, let me just, in a nutshell, rephrase what I think the essential point of my paper is, and that is that individualism is a highly contested concept. In the history of American thought, individualism as a concept first appeared in the 1830s, both with, most famously, de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, but in fact earlier with some of the French socialist thinkers that had contributed this concept to the debate in Europe, which was then imported to the United States, and has been deployed by various thinkers throughout the 19th century as a descriptive term for American characteristics, and then adapted in the 20th century, and then argued over in the 20th century, and continues, I think, to be, evidence of this conference alone shows that it's a contested concept still. And so one of the reasons that I cast my paper in the way that I did is that I think it's necessary for us, if we're going to grapple with these questions about how individualism and the collective good meet, how they interact, what are their relationships, it's important for us to be clear that at least we're talking about the same kind of phenomenon. That when we ask the question, well, what is the common good really? We also need to ask the question, what is individualism? It's had a number of different meanings. And as I note in the paper, I think the other leading problem in just deploying this, just saying individualism or self-interest as it's often construed, is at some points both too broad and too narrow, ironically, both at the same time, I think. It's too broad in the sense that I think individualism or self-interest is often referred to as a catch-all for a descriptive term, a catch-all descriptive term for people's motivations. Economists, I think, at the conferences where I deal with them, like to deploy this as a catch-all term. People are self-interested. It's just a fact of nature. Then we argue about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and make nice graphs and equations to explain that. But by being so broad, by using this term as though all human motivation, or at least the majority of human motivation, exists on a plane of self-interest, it also becomes a bit too narrow. It becomes too easy to just say, well, we all know what individualism is. We all know what that first motive is. The question then, in this case, when it's used so narrowly, is let's move on and ask about other motivations or things that we can do to correct this or things that we can do to move beyond this. But I think that to really struggle with the concept of individualism, we have to recognize that it's something more than that because of that contested nature. People have used different meanings, and ultimately I think that there is a right meaning and a proper meaning for the term and how we use it. So just briefly, the history that I tell in the paper begins, of course, with de Tocqueville, the famous, at least the most famous of the initial uses of the idea of individualism. And de Tocqueville, as many of you know, a young French aristocrat who came to the United States, the young United States, as did many European intellectuals, curious about this new thing that they called America. And Tocqueville was particularly interested in the idea of what democracy was doing in this new nation, and he was more interested, in fact, in what that meant for the French Republic at the time that he was so concerned about than he was in describing America. But as it turns out, of course, the book that he ended up writing, the 2-volume work, was as fascinating for Americans as it was for Frenchmen. That was his intended audience. And de Tocqueville came to the United States originally, which some of you may not know, to study prison reform. His stated mission, his charge, as a lower-level bureaucrat in the French Republic was to study how Americans were reforming their prisons. Now, the 9 months that he and Beaumont spent in the country, traveling, I think to some, probably about 80% of the different states, all the way as far west as Green Bay, south to Louisiana, I think maybe even into Georgia and the farthest southern point, all along the eastern seaboard. He met with presidents, Supreme Court justices, governors, senators, prominent business figures, really an amazing tour. And in this, he was particularly curious about what he saw as the distinctive American traits. What was it that defined Americans as a character? Because he thought that this characteristic of Americans was what the consequence of their democratic system was. Remember, this is a fairly new system. At the time, many European intellectuals expected the American experiment to fail. They didn't believe that this would last, that it was a fleeting and rather unsuccessful type of design. What de Tocqueville found, of course, was that it was robust, it was functioning very well, Americans took very seriously their mission, their political system, and they embraced this idea which he described as individualism, which he distinguished from mere, as he would have called it, selfishness or mere egotism, a kind of monomaniacal concern with self, where everything is defined in terms of one self. That literally nothing has meaning in this view, according to de Tocqueville, except for oneself. And distinguished it on the other side from the idea of communal interest, a more European idea of serving the common good, serving the French people or serving the French nation. Individualism, as he described it, was this calm and mature feeling. The sense that one owed no one any obligation, demanded nothing of anyone else, and could exist in a sense independent of others. And when he said independent, he didn't mean literally economically independent or in a way physically independent, as many Americans later came to associate the concept with moving out to the frontier, being on one's own. What he meant was independent in a kind of political status. For de Tocqueville, this was a problem. As a European intellectual, he saw this American experiment and really the Americans' embrace of individualism as dangerous, because he believed that it was a force pulling apart the nation, that Americans had embraced this but had found ways to ameliorate it through private associations, through their churches, through the other aspects of American culture that he saw as distinctive. But for de Tocqueville, the main problem with individualism, I think, grew out of the problems that he was struggling with himself in understanding the American political experiment. As a European coming from the old world and looking at this American experiment, what was the most distinctive feature of this was the Enlightenment political system that developed out of the American founding, that was unlike the political systems of contemporary Europe. And he had a very difficult time understanding this because, in many ways, this was liberating of individuals, individual citizens, and gave them a kind of political and moral autonomy that he was unaccustomed to. And it was his fear that this autonomy would have a kind of sort of center-out drag on the population. And he worried that this individualism would be tearing apart the common institutions of the country. But he was fascinated by the fact that it wasn't. So it was something of a paradox for de Tocqueville. Through the 19th century, just to kind of briefly fast forward the story, individualism was often then embraced by Americans once they became familiar with the concept through de Tocqueville as a badge of honor, as something that marked them apart from the old world. They had, as their revolutionary heritage told them, distinguished themselves from the old world by giving up on old alliances, on old systems of class, on old systems of hierarchy, that they were, in a sense, politically equal. The great celebration of democracy in its ideal, in the idea of literal equality, of course not being true descriptively, was what Americans came to associate individualism with. The idea that we all functioned on the same level, politically and morally, that people were equal. Now, of course, historically that was more constrained, but that was the ideal, that was the aspiration. By the late 19th century, the concept had come to mean be more tied with economic individualism. The idea is expressed by William Graham Sumner and others in the late 19th century, suggested that individualism was a concept that should be applied economically. Not necessarily politically, not necessarily morally, but economically, that there ought to be a functional independence of individuals in the economic realm. Now, what this meant in practice largely was arguments about the idea of contractual relations between individuals, that there would be a free contract. One of the great conflicts of the late 19th century was the degree to which autonomous individuals could make free contracts with one another in business, in labor relations, etc. And the late 19th century writers who embraced individualism thought that this was the guiding concept, that if everyone was independent, as they described them, economically, then they ought to be left free to pursue their own economic relations, unadulterated, unmediated by the state. This then produced, as I discussed in the paper, the first real critical response to 19th century individualism, the progressive critique. The progressives, particularly Charles Beard and John Dewey, took that concept of individualism and took it as it was expressed indeed by then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover and said, this doesn't make any sense. There's a problem here. We look out and you're saying people are individualists, that people can be independent, that they can have, as de Tocqueville said, this calm detachment from other people. Unfortunately, they said, the reality is that they don't have that kind of independence. Economically, they would say, we are interdependent, that there's a meshing of interests and needs and values. And therefore, individualism must be a false concept. It must be a false construct that people use to celebrate a kind of notion of themselves without actually being accurately descriptive of their situation. Because we all know no man is an island. No one could survive in this country economically detached from and separated from other individuals. And so they engaged in this critique by saying individualism ought not to be that aspirational ideal. We ought to pull ourselves back from that. We ought to recognize the nature and the need for collective action. In particular, Dewey's book, Individualism, Old and New, coming in the wake of the Great Crash and during the Great Depression, he argued that collective action, collective planning, social action, not based on individuals, but based on group needs, based on the needs of the whole, ought to predominate. And his idea of individualism suggested, he wanted to save the concept, but suggested that individualism was something that came after group needs, not before them. Americans in the 19th century would have said, as de Tocqueville described, individualism was ultimately what resulted in the common good. That individuals acting to their own common good, Americans would frequently tell him, this is what actually leads to me helping others, because I see an interest in it. I see my long-term good in acting in a way that does benefit others because it benefits me. And Americans, he would have described, would have justified their action in such a way. Dewey and Beard and others who criticized this concept in the early part of the 20th century would have said, this is just so much rhetoric. What people really need to do is recognize that they need to accomplish the common good first, as Dewey would have described it, in order to achieve effective freedom. Not literal freedom in the sense of unmolested by outsiders, by the government, but effective freedom, which for Dewey would have meant the ability to accomplish social goals. This was a redefinition of individualism. And it was in many ways a critique of individualism of the old model that, despite Dewey's attempt to save the term, really relegated it to a kind of antiquated notion. It became in American thought something that was the old, the idea that we've rejected, that thing that has long ago been abandoned by American thinkers. Until the New Deal and into the 1940s and 50s, when there was again another response against this anti-individualism or this critique of individualism by those who would have called themselves the new individualists. There were probably dozens of thinkers who identified with this. There were journals, the New Individualist Review, and other publications that celebrated individualism. And I think that the most influential of these, and certainly the most consistent of these, is Ayn Rand, the thinker who identified herself as an individualist and developed an entire philosophic structure based around her idea of individualism. And her response was primarily, I think, derived from the type of philosophic questions that she asked. Rather than focus on a descriptive model of individualism or of self-interest as being something that can be identified with motivational structures or with the way that people acted, she actually brought the idea of individualism, of self-interest, down to a deeper level philosophically. For her, it was not so much just an economic or even a political concept. As I described in the paper, it was more of a moral epistemological concept. That individualism for her rests on the fact that individual minds have this autonomy and need to be recognized as having this autonomy, such that the political system that develops as a hierarchically subsequent level recognizes things like individual rights and individual autonomy. And I think one of the consequences of this, one of the interesting consequences of this, is that because she defended individualism as a theoretical insight, rather than merely using it, deploying it as a descriptive term, one of the things that changes about her view compared to others who had embraced individualism is that she takes it in a more, as I described it, in a more robust way, that it means more. It's not as reductive in her use of it. And some of the ways I think that this happens, that her insight really changes this, is that if you take, for example, the problem of collective action in an economic context, right? And now, a traditional defense of individualism would say that collective action only comes about, or only ought to come about, when individuals can see, as de Tocqueville would have said, that other interest that they have in, that this collective good serves my interest as well. That I'll sacrifice some of my narrow self-interest in order to accomplish a collective good because I see an enlightened view of what might come about as a result of this that might benefit me. Right? That I'll act with others so that I don't develop a bad reputation, or so that I don't end up having retributions against me in the future, and this benefits me, right? In the way that Sarah was describing the action of these monkeys, that they realize that, or the chimpanzees, I guess in particular, they realize that they need to act in a particular way because this develops a reputation and they may face harm in the future. Well, for Rand, this is a different kind of perspective. In a way, it inverts this perspective. That the individualism that exists, because it's focused on the moral autonomy of the individual, to make decisions for himself and to be independent of others, not swayed by the political or moral structures that are imposed upon the individual, but rather existing to make those decisions himself, that what happens is, on a political and economic level, what she embraces is what she called the Trado Principle. That there are, of course, interdependencies economically. We're not all, of course, constructing our own automobiles and inventing our own systems of lighting and power in order to survive. We trade with others in order to accomplish those goals. And likewise, I think she would say that in this problem of the common good, of collective action, what is uniquely defined in a system of what she would envision as a system of individualism is the idea that such things come about not because of actors aiming at those things, but because of the trading that takes place, because of the values that people exchange, and that the key here is not about what those values accomplish as a collective goal, but the terms on which those exchanges take place. Individualism for Rand is a condition in a way, that this is a condition by which we measure the justice or the appropriateness of these interactions. And as I note in the paper, the theorist Tom Palmer has noted, the really interesting thing about the question of the social good or the common good is not so much whether individualism is incompatible with it, but rather how it answers that question. To assume that the common good is somehow divorced from individualism or is in opposition to it is, I think, to restrict the concept of the common good too narrowly. The question is, how do we define the terms by which, one, we answer the question of what the common good is, and then secondly, what are the means by which we can accomplish the common good? What is the appropriate means by which we can do that? Are certain social and political processes appropriate to that or not? For Ayn Rand, the answer, of course, would have been the certain social and moral processes are that individuals have to retain that autonomy, that freedom to make up their own minds, to live according to their own judgment, with like freedom for others, and that the common good that results from that, the things that they act together to gain and to develop through joint action rather than through merely literal individual action, have to come about on those terms, on the terms of individual rights, that individuals trade with each other, rather than individuals being compelled or being shamed or being encouraged to do these things through other social processes, or at the bottom, of course, being forced, being compelled by the group to engage in these processes. And so one of the interesting insights, I think, that this leads us to is that for Ayn Rand, for her definition of individualism, individualism and self-interest are not defaults. They're actually accomplishments. They're something that one has to rise to, that one has to identify and properly integrate into one's life in order to accomplish. That self-interest is not just when I act in a way that I think is going to please me. Instead, self-interest is when I actually identify those things which benefit my life. So for Rand, this is, in a way, it's almost a more metaphysical concept. The idea being that for one to accomplish one's self-interest, it's not enough to say that one has a particular motive, or even that one acts toward a particular end. But rather, one has to integrate that end with the actual requirements of human life to see whether that end serves one's life or whether it's detrimental to that life. And so too, this applies, of course, to the political realm. One doesn't have to ask the question, is this actor, motivated sufficiently by the common good or not? One has to ask, is that actually a common good? Is it actually good for people that this is a goal of certain actors in society? Does it actually serve their interests as people in this community? That's the key question that we have to ask. Or what are these means? What means are available? It's in a way, a trump. Individualism says people have to have that autonomy to accomplish their goals. As such, a political economic system has to exist in a way that recognizes that autonomy. And for her, that means recognition of individual rights. The idea that collective processes, collective joint action, have to take place through voluntary trade or voluntary cooperative action by individuals, not forced from the outside. And that perspective that individualism or self-interest it has to be something that's accomplished, something that actually is achieved rather than is a default, also leads to the interesting insight that frequently what people do, and even what people say they're doing in their self-interest, is not in their self-interest. That they can be mistaken, that they can have errors, and that their judgments may be wrong, that they can misidentify what they believe to be in their self-interest and act in ways that are in fact contrary to their self-interest. The bank robber, right? The exploitative individual who attempts to get one over on other people. That these actions, although premised on the idea perhaps that he thinks he's serving himself, that hey, I'm going to get away with it, I'm going to get something for nothing, are actually contrary to his interests. Not so much because of the possibility of being caught, but because what he's doing, the bank robber for example, what he's doing in such an action is short-circuiting the necessary relationship between the values that he seeks to gain and the appropriate means by which one gains those values, i.e. through productive work. If you want $1 million, you don't just go rob a bank. That value doesn't actually represent what it does to you as what it would for someone who actually works for those values. He's short-circuiting the process that's part of our nature, that those goods, those values must be produced by a particular means. Now, of course, there is also the possibility of being caught. There's the possibility of continual psychological distress as a result of the fear of being caught, the lies that one has to tell in order to support this whole scheme of stealing the money, right? You start spending it, when you move to another town, when you retreat to the Caribbean, you have to explain this to people. Where did you get the money? You have to lie, all of these problems that accrue. But this means that people can be mistaken not only about self-interest, but that they can also be mistaken about what they think the collective interest is. That the big problem is not, do people aim at one good or another? The question is, do they actually identify in reality what are the requirements of their life that do serve their interest? And do they identify in reality what things, what values actually are in the common good, or are they merely identifying things which are more narrowly in the group interest or in the interest of some pressure group or some interest group in society that are not in fact in the common good? So in the case of some of the discussion that we had yesterday, when someone poses as serving the common good, when someone poses as saying, look, I'm doing this in the interest of everyone, they may be mistaken about that. They may be fooling people, they may simply be mistaken. One of the insights I think that Adam Smith, going back all the way to the origin of the discussion of self-interest, one of the Smith's insights, I think, is the fact that as often, or in fact, in Smith's opinion, more often, people who aim and say that they're working for the common good do worse to the common good than those who merely pursue their own interests, right, with Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand. That those who pose as being other-oriented are often those who are more destructive of the needs and values of others than those who merely go about their own business and benefit others through the trading relationship. So I think one of the bottom lines then is that we need to take self-interest, self-regard, and individualism as something more than a descriptive concept. Something more than merely saying motivationally people think they're aiming in their interest, or they say they're aiming at their interest, or they try to aim at their interest. And we need to recognize that there are actions that are self-regarding, which are either exploitative or destructive, which are not actual instances of self-interest, right? When one does not accomplish, just like when I think perhaps that the heroin is going to serve my interest because it makes me feel good, but it doesn't actually, because it's a detriment to my health. It imperils my ability to be productive. It imperils my ability to be active in pursuing my other values. That's a false notion of what's in my interest. I'm mistaken there. And then what needs to happen is we need to recognize that this is a robust concept, that one has to accomplish individualism. One has to say, it's not that I'm literally cutting ties with everyone, breaking off from the group and telling everyone else to go to hell. It's rather that I recognize my need as a human being to make my own decisions, to come to my own conclusions, to live as a morally autonomous person, and recognize that among others, and then adopt the right relationships with others based on that observation. That the right relationship then is a trading relationship, one in which people identify values that they wish to exchange and then bargain openly on the terms that are appropriate to such exchanges, which is premised on what I've said, the voluntary, non-coercive exchanges that recognize the rights of individuals. This, I think, is what the concept of individualism ought to represent, that it's not a predatory but a more enlightened view of individualism, of self-interest, that exists and that is possible, and that in our discussions about what the common good might mean, the common good, in my view, to answer the question that has been posed since the beginning, the common good is nothing more than the aggregate good of each individual. That one cannot accomplish the common good if that common good ever imperils or involves the detriment of any individual in the group. That if any individual's rights are violated, if any individual is forced to do something that that individual does not choose, that is by default not the common good. The common good cannot be more than the sum of its parts. It is literally the good of each member of what is defined as the common. And so it's a very individualist perspective, admittedly, on what the common good is, that the individuals all come together and that all bring this view that what's in their good is ultimately to have that autonomy and moral independence protected. That actually constitutes the common good. A system whereby individual rights are protected and individuals are left free to pursue their interests and engage in trading relationships with others. That is for the good of all, because that recognizes in everyone that moral political autonomy to be free and to engage in those activities. So just to identify some of the connections, maybe some of the differences, as I promised to do, I think that one of the interesting things about the possibility of mistakenness derives out of, not only out of some of the observations that Dan has made, but later Michael in making some of the observations about people's philanthropic activity, sometimes leading to consequences they don't want. I think that Tversky and Kahneman's ideas about how people can mistakenly evaluate what's in their self-interest, so true applies to their mistakenness about what's in the common interest, that they can be deceived in a way or they can be distorted in their views of this. And compared to, for example, Brian's paper, I think one of the things that we need to distinguish is the difference between predatoriness and pursuit of self-interest and the kind of exploitativeness on the one hand, which is conventionally described as maybe psychological egoism, people who pursue their own self-interest without regard for what is actually in their interest, or as de Tocqueville described it, this narrow sense of egotism or selfishness versus enlightened self-interest, or self-interest as he described it, rightly understood. I think when he says rightly understood, what he means is understood in the way that it actually serves one's interest, right? And that such processes of exploitation or lying or fraudulent activity or activity which forces other people to do things that are against their interests is not, in fact, in one's self-interest and ought to be relegated to a different category. That these are different types of actions. That they're the mirage of self-interest, and that we need a more descriptive term to apply to those because they, in fact, don't serve the interests of the individual, even though he believes they do. So, in sum, I guess what I'll say to wrap up and to leave as much time for questions as I can, which I guess is quite a bit of time, I think that it's important for us to really chew on this idea of individualism, identify whether whether one agrees with my construal and Ayn Rand's view of it or not, but to be clear about what of these many different definitions and what of these many different views one is arguing about. To recognize that the concept has to be fixed in order for us to have a debate, a discussion, and interaction based upon that. Because when we don't, when we have concepts that on the one hand might be descriptive and on the other hand might be theoretical and on yet another hand might be methodological, we're not really talking to each other. We're talking past each other. We need to focus on what we mean and then actually debate whether that concept is the one that we want to use, whether it's the right concept or not, rather than just sort of, ships passing in the night. Individualism means this, individualism means that. We actually need to get together and have that debate, have that argument. So, I guess I've left, I don't, till 10 o'clock? Yeah, so about 20 minutes for questions, I hope. So, questions? Yes, I guess we have the microphone coming around.
Thanks for a very good talk, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to formulate my question, but I'm trying to understand how predatoriness and mistakenness and something that I don't think you have talked about, conflict between interests, all fit together. And as you described the common good as being the aggregate of all individual goods, and if many people, I don't know how many people you think, typically are mistaken about their individual good, and how they make judgments, or who makes judgments about what's predatory and what's not predatory. You seem to describe an ideal world where if everybody's smart, they won't be predatory and it'll all work out. And I just wonder whether that view sufficiently understands the probability of predatoriness. And I'm not being very clear, but that's...
No, well, let me offer something. If it's sufficiently close to what you're thinking about, then good. If not, maybe you can clarify. I think one of the really interesting things, one of the things that I remember reading that really struck me of Ayn Rand's view is the idea that she believes that there are no conflicts of interest among rational men. And now this sort of gets at what you're talking about. What if there's a propensity to be mistaken, if people are mistaken and their pursuit of their self-interest is not automatic or is not default, then isn't there a large possibility, whether we say 50% of the people or 80% of the people or 20% of the people, that people's pursuit of their interests will necessarily conflict with others because of that possibility of error. But I think that the key underlying fact there is not the question of whether such instances will occur, but what are the ground rules for how we resolve those types of disputes. Because in a system that doesn't, in my view, that isn't based upon a proper recognition of individualism, those disputes might be resolved with the group telling the individual, look, you're wrong and we're going to punish you. Or your pursuit of your interest, you have sufficient number of people behind you who are also mistaken, and so you can compel the individual to do this. But the important question is about what are those ground rules. And if the ground rules are that individuals have to treat each other as autonomous and morally self-defining beings, the recognition that others might be mistaken leaves one with the choice of either persuasion and reasoning with that individual to try to convince that individual, look, you think this might be in your interest, but it's not. And here's how I'm going to explain to you. Or to simply leave the individual alone. And that, because ultimately, as Ayn Rand says, the two means of changing a person's mind, or really, and ultimately, changing their behavior, is either persuasion or compulsion. And if the ground rules say compulsion is out, that recognizing everyone's individual rights and recognizing everyone's individual ability, or at least potential ability, to appraise correctly their self-interest, then the means left open to one is persuasion. And that those conflicts of interest have to be resolved, or the seeming conflicts of interest have to be resolved through a process of persuasion, through a process whereby we can deal or not deal with individuals, illustrate, explain, whatever it happens to be, so that those individuals may come to know that. And I don't think that this society would be one in which everyone has to have some genius level of knowledge to appraise what's in their self-interest. I think that in such a society, the functioning of that society, economically, politically, is going to be one in which that kind of interest is rewarded, and that kind of interest is something that people will come to understand better through the fact that it's not immunized from the consequences of making the wrong decision. Right? I mean, one of the critiques that I would have of why people don't appraise their self-interest properly today, why are there so many people who act in ways that they believe are in their self-interest but in fact are not, is that often the consequences of those bad decisions has been short-circuited. That, I mean, whether it's a Citibank getting bailed out, or whether it's a drug user being immunized through the consequences of his own decision. It exists all across the spectrum. And those decisions, when something steps in and short circuits the proper, in reality, the consequence of one's choices, that ultimately leads people not to, through experience, learn what's in their self-interest. And one of the great insights, I think, also of Adam Smith, people often assume that Adam Smith's really distinctive thing was that he said that the self-interest aggregated, the invisible hand. But one of the other things that's often not noted in The Wealth of Nations is the belief that Adam Smith had that average people could come to a knowledge of their self-interest. Prior to Adam Smith, the belief was that they needed some social superior, that they needed someone more enlightened, higher up on the hierarchy, some social better, to instruct them as to their self-interest, because average people, the commoner, the worker, whatever, didn't have the capacity to judge what was in his self-interest. And Smith was as radical in his suggestion that self-interest would aggregate to the common good as he was in his suggestion that the average man did not need a priest or a politician or a social better to tell him, you don't know it paternalistically, but this is in your interest. That he believed that these individuals had the capacity. And that's really what that whole Enlightenment view of each individual's capacity to come to the right answers rests upon, is the belief that individual reason has the efficacy and potency to appraise what's actually in one's interest. Because to assume otherwise is to assume that there are certain people who need paternalistically to be taken care of, that they are perpetual children that will never be able to appraise themselves, no matter how many instances of making the bad decision and facing the consequences, they'll just never learn what's in their interest. I think that's a rather dim view of human nature. I'd like to take the more optimistic view that people can actually figure those things out.
Mine kind of goes off of that a little bit, what you were just saying. My question when I was listening to your whole talk was, in all of your studies and in your thought processes, in terms of the United States of America and our foundations and how we came about, and my question is, do you think that part of why the process seemed to be working, and ultimately I think does, is because of the foundation of Christianity, the Protestant religion, and how part of the democracy is based on a lot of those theories. And in terms of basically the priesthood of the believer, the autonomy of man, and I'm talking about Protestant, not necessarily Catholicism, but the priesthood of the believer, the autonomy of man, that we are made in the image of God, and that we have the capability of making good moral decisions. God is good, therefore, if we are made in the image of God, we have that goodness in us. And individualism in that autonomy, in that priesthood believer concept, Christianity, affords us this ability to make good decisions individually, like what you were talking about, just taking that enlightenment a little bit further. And that the opposite of that is the sinful nature of man, and that the mistakes, the greed, the control, the predatory nature, the robbery, the things that go against this and that we're arguing about in terms of, well, what's for the collective good, etc., is really the basic foundation of the sinful nature of man, and that really man in and of itself is good, fighting that sinful nature, but that the individualism Therefore, we're able to, like Rand said, make those good decisions and make the moral decisions and do the trading system and then the economic system, et cetera, everything else falls into place. But, you know, the United States of America, even though we are young, we've been pretty successful at the democracy. The problems do arise when maybe all these other things come into place. But the curiosity that the rest of the world had with it perhaps is because that's when taking that Christianity and that autonomy of man came into play and used it in a democracy form.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I would say, in the broadest view, yes and no. In the broad historical development, I think that Christianity as such, if you look at sort of millennia of thought, the early Christian concept of the focus on individual salvation as opposed to a kind of collective pleasure of the gods and pleasing of the gods, certainly in the kind of long historical view, had an influence on refocusing attention on the individual. I don't subscribe to the view that the American experiment had a particular benefit from that, mostly because in my reading of the 18th century, what's happening in American intellectual history is that there's a great conflict between the Enlightenment views and the kind of Protestant Reformation views, which at the time in the 18th century were not nearly so optimistic about human nature and its ability to choose the good. I mean, we're still talking about a very Calvinist, a very harsh doctrine of the inherent sinfulness of man and the inevitability of depravity. And I think that what really emerges in the 18th century in American thought is the secularization, or at least the relegation of individual belief about salvation and about God and about these questions to the private sphere. And that what happens is the recognition of these Enlightenment values, that everyone has the capacity to make these choices, that everyone can be politically equal, that everyone has moral autonomy, are based as much in part of a rejection of the Christian view of any kind of hierarchy and any kind of means by which the state can determine the truth of those questions. And what happens is people gradually realize that it's impossible. I mean, the whole arc of separation of church and state comes out of that Enlightenment view that those questions have to be questions that are left outside of the political sphere, because those are questions that ultimately cannot be resolved merely through the persuasion axis, but have to be solved through the compulsion axis. That one can, no matter how much one, as James Madison noted in his remonstrance on free exercise during Virginia's debates about the statute of religious freedom, he noted that as much as one can compel outward behavior, right? One can make another person cross oneself, say the right prayers, say the right rituals, that in the end, what is in that person's true belief is still open to that person, that one cannot compel the mind. That what a person thinks is going to clash with that compelled behavior. And if that's the case, then the efficacy of compulsion in compelling belief is really futile. That in his argument, or in going all the way back to Milton, who really developed this argument, God would know the difference, right? You can make someone do all of the wrong rituals, but if in his heart he truly believes that isn't going to change his status. The real insight of the founders, I think, is to say individualism has to be based on these things that are open to persuasion. And the political system has to be based upon reason and argument. And faith necessarily has to take a private place in that, and that it can't be part of what this political system is going to accommodate because of that inability of people to do anything but resort to compulsion. No matter how much we have an argument, if I can't persuade you, the only way that I can change your behavior to fit rightly with what I see is through compulsion. And if you apply that politically, for example, if I think that's immoral for someone to, let's say, consume trans fats, right? If I say, look, consuming trans fats is bad for you, you don't realize it, I can't persuade you, I've given you all the evidence and you just simply reject it. The only way that I can compel that behavior is by either banning them or forcing you not to consume them. Or I can say, you're autonomous, you can make the decisions whether or not they're in your self-interest. I think that Christianity even in the kind of form that it developed into the 19th century, not so much the Calvinist view, but even into the 19th century, necessarily had a view that these beliefs ultimately had to resort to some kind of compulsion. And that's all actually antagonistic to the American system. So the idea that certain moral outcomes or certain beliefs, I mean, the development in the 19th century of the Christian, of the Great Republic was that such immoral behavior, such mistakes would be outlawed, would be the subject of legislation, prohibition in many of the states, and Sabbath observance laws, and the Sunday meals law, and a lot of the blue laws were passed under the idea that we haven't been able to persuade people, we ultimately have to compel them to make those right decisions that we believe are in their self-interest, because ultimately the trust that those people can do that themselves, the evidence of their behavior tells us that it's not there. And one of Ayn Rand's, sometimes for people, troubling insights is that you have to allow people to be wrong. You have to allow people to make bad decisions for themselves, and as long as those bad decisions don't imperil forcing other people or defrauding other people, that those people, you can persuade them, you can assist them, you can do everything you want through voluntary exchange, but compelling them not to make those bad decisions is off the table. And I think that that's consistent with the view that the founders had of a republic whereby people are politically autonomous, and that private moral belief remains private and remains part of the interaction that people have, but it stays off that, the table for political action. Another question?
Yes, I think it might be possible to make this story, since you call it a story, a little bit more complicated. In 1935, Hayek writes a piece called Individualism, True and False, and he traces individualism through the French socialists, the rationalist thinking, and I think that's where Rand fits. You've mentioned Smith a couple of times. Smith is in the Baconian side, the true individualism, as Hayek says, and the difference then between the Smithian notion, which goes through Hayek and comes now to the experimentalists in the 20th century, is that people are interconnected. They're not atomistic. They're self-interested, but they have a desire for approbation. And that's what gets the experimental results in the 20th century, where people share, even though there's no direct benefit from sharing. There's no reputational effects. There's nothing in the future, and so on. So it seems to me that there's a Randian individualism in which we are atomistic, but there's a much richer notion of individualism, which, as I say, is a Hayekian one, where we are interconnected. We have property rights and so on, and we trade, but we don't just trade goods, we trade approbation as well. And I think that gives a really different notion that you might want to think about.
Yeah, I'll have to confess that one of the great disappointments in myself is that the more complex parts of the story, there's a whole complexity of the late 19th century, and then Hayek's view, and a lot of the other development of this notion of individualism that I simply, I think I included the word brief history, because it is a very rich story, how individualism has been understood. My take on Hayek's argument there, which I fit into Hayek's broader argument about this, what I guess he would describe methodological individualism, the idea of the kind of, as the French socialists, the top-down view versus the spontaneous order. And I disagree with him there, and I actually think I would fit Rand somewhere in maybe a third category there. I see where Hayek is coming from on the idea that the atomistic individualists would want to suggest that people have to be autonomous in a more literal sense and trade with each other and have these relations, and that his view is that people actually have a more robust set of values that they exchange, and that as individuals they interconnect with people beyond mere economic exchange, and that such orders, I think Hayek would argue, have to emerge out of the historical practice, out of spontaneous order. The problem that I have with Hayek in that regard, and with his overall argument, is that Hayek comes at that argument largely from an anti-reason point of view, in that he thinks that the reason why the atomistic individualists are wrong, or the reason why, for example, socialist planning is wrong, he thinks the same argument, that it implies that one individual mind or one set of minds is capable of ascertaining the truth of that and going forward with confidence in that, instead of the kind of collective process. I mean, in a way, Hayek, interestingly, although certainly on the side of individualism, would say that it's actually the collective, anonymous, spontaneous order that develops that leads us to the truth, rather than any one individual figuring that out. And his reasoning for that, I think, is because he doesn't trust, ultimately, the power of the individual mind to ascertain that truth, that might be mistaken. I think Rand actually fits not with the atomistic individualists and not with Hayek's view, but actually more on the order that I think she recognizes the non-material values and that those exchanges take place. One of the illustration of her Trado Principle is not confined to mere economic relationships. I mean, controversially, she thinks that this applies to romantic love. And when most people say, well, you know, how can you say that love is a trading relationship? How can you say that friendship? How can you say that all these non-material values are also subject to that? And her answer is that it's the same individualism at the core. That one's values, whether they be material or spiritual or romantic or whatever, that those values have to have as their premise the ground rules of, look, I can value what I want. I can say love is more important than income, or income is more important than love, or whatever my personal hierarchy happens to be. But as long as I'm given the right to trade those and to go on to the marketplace, whether the marketplace of labor or the marketplace of love, and exchange those values freely with other people, that's what's most important. And that the individual mind says, look, these are the ground rules. And that's what's important. And Hayek might criticize her for that, because that is, in a sense, the more atomistic or the more top-down model of saying, we know that these are the rules. It's not that they developed out of the spontaneous order. It's not that they have this historic grounding. These are true, and these are necessary. What develops out of that, as long as those ground rules are followed, is up to the individual. Whereas Hayek would say, no, that has to be more of a development process. So I would actually situate her somewhere outside of that dichotomy that he draws, because I don't think, like the atomistic individualists that he's criticizing, she wants to impose those top-down values on people, but rather that there are the ground rules. The atomistic individualists want to imply that there are only one set of values that everyone ought to pursue. We've ascertained the truth, and everyone ought to do this, 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 and this in their particular values. And that's why Hayek rightly criticizes that. That, I think, is a wrong approach to individualism. One cannot ascertain the truth for how everyone ought to relate to some particular value. That there are options available there in the diversity of human life and in the pursuit of different values. He's right to criticize them, but I don't think that Rand quite fits in that. I think that her view is more, as I said, that kind of theoretical groundwork that makes possible this trader interaction, which in its practice is very much like Hayek's view of the social order, which is spontaneous and exchanging of both material and spiritual values. But it's the difference between her view that there is a necessary groundwork versus his view that that develops all the way down as the spontaneous order. We have time for one last question, perhaps?
Well, this is fairly sparked a good deal of interest in here, fortunately. And that we've juggled the order of presentations with Dr. Roth, who also, I believe, takes an individualistic approach himself. Who's going to present next? If we could move along with
Sure.
Our schedule. Thank you very much.
Thank you.